Hello everyone, and welcome to the last of the 4 sessions of the crisis cycle. Thank you for joining us today, but also thank you for joining us in the previous sessions and especially in the symposium on Friday. All the sessions are going to be uploaded. Some of them, I think, they have already been uploaded on YouTube, so you can follow up with the ones that you have missed. In the first session, we discussed the current crisis and the distinction between political economy and economics. In the second session, we covered Keynesian economics, New Deal's welfare state, and how they also led to the current crisis of neoliberalism. And in this final session, we're going, Will and Ricardo are going to cover the basic principles of the foundations of political economy according to Marx. So we will start with Rick, and then Will take over. And in this session, we will have only we will start with presentations, the one next to the other, and we will leave the discussion for the end. So I don't know, Will, whether you would like to try to share your screen. Are you ready sharing?
No, I'm going to start, so I'm sharing.
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm sorry, yes. Yeah, I got confused. I'm looking at Will for some reason at the moment.
High pressure. Yeah, so today, definitely check out the YouTube VODs of the first 2 sessions. The symposium is probably going to take a bit longer to appear on YouTube because we need to have like consent from all the speakers. It takes a little bit longer. This session, or today's session, will probably also be uploaded fairly quick since it's just the 3 of us. So we are in the long run. The session where we will explain why it turns out Keynes is not sufficient, and we've been up till now essentially. This is like a big point we try to make in the symposium. We don't really care that much about the difference between reform and revolution, which is a typical debate within the lefts. The current fundamental problem that we have is that there's this thing called the radical that we think has an opposition to the other two, right? Well, today we are actually going to be talking about this difference between reform and revolution. So let's get going and start where we sort of were in the last session. We have this kind of epic struggle between that is playing out today again, all over again, between demand side economics and supply side economics. This is a struggle that has been going on for more than 100 years. And we have discussed this issue in the context of the development of economics, of neoclassical economics in the late 19th century, early 20th, and especially in the context of the deep crisis that capitalism was in the beginning of the 20th century. And you have essentially the position of neoclassical economists that Milton Friedman then kind of becomes sort of the guru of the neoliberal version of it, as they are re-implemented after the 70s. But in the 20s and 30s, we had this kind of large debate where neoclassical economists essentially were making the point that the market will sort itself out in the long run. We are in a crisis, but markets tend towards equilibrium. So leave it alone, and it will sort itself out. In the long run, it will be fine. We don't need to do anything. And Keynes is coming in within the logic of economics, saying, well, in the long run, we are all going to be dead. This is a famous quote from him. It comes from this book from 1923. And he's essentially saying that, thinking that like waiting until capitalism sorts itself out and reaches balance again, even though it's constantly not reaching balance all the time. Like, is it there yet? No. Is it there yet? No. Keynes says, like, we need to do something about it. We need to intervene. We need government intervention, right? Just waiting for the long run where everything balances itself out is not good enough. And in the current moment, of course, when we're talking about in the long run, we're all dead, in the context of the crisis of climate, definitely this has an even greater, we have even more reasons today to kind of be on the side of Keynes here and to kind of like Keynes' position. We need to do something, we need government intervention to do what the free market cannot. However, we have a kind of complicated problem. Returning to the little spirally graphs that we used in the first session. So when we're talking about the climate, the crisis of the current crisis, in the context of climate, we are talking about a situation where our economic system just can't stop exponentially growing more and more and more, therefore consuming more and more of Earth's resources. Therefore, it is unsustainable in the context of a limited environment. This is the crisis of climate, right? And the fundamental, the goal that we have is to change the way the system works so that we can harmonize the thing and so we can control the rate of growth in order to make it sustainable. These are graphs that we've shown just as a very simple visual illustration of the way people think about these issues. Now, of course, the problem is that we know we are not in a cycle of infinite expansion. At the same time that we're discussing the climate of crisis, we are also dealing with the crisis of capital. And the crisis of capital, in many ways, is sort of the opposite of the crisis of climate. It's not that we are having kind of infinite, continuous, exponential, and uncontrollable expansion. Is that capitalism ceases to be able to grow. It runs into limits to its own growth. That's what the crisis is. There is limits to, people are not consuming enough. Capitalists do not have return of investment. They have no reason to invest, and we enter a recession. So when we're talking about the crisis of the economy, the crisis of capital, and the crisis of climate, it seems like there is a contradiction, right? Well, no, there is no contradiction. But for that, we need to stop thinking about just one spiral and need to think about two spirals. We need to make a kind of distinction between crisis of capital and crisis of climate. The issue that we have is that when there is when capitalists have a very high difficulty in getting return on investment, they need to find sources of profit at the shortest possible. They need the short-term guarantees on profit. They need the quickest buck they can get. And so the capability to invest in long-term returns simply ceases to exist. I mean, it's always hard for capitalism to think in long-term investment, but in crises is when it's really, really impossible. And what does it mean when we're talking about solving the crisis of climate, when we're talking about switching, for example, from fossil fuels to sustainable energy production? We're talking about long-term investments. We're talking about a large-scale investment now that will only reap benefits much later. So precisely because of the contraction of the economy in capitalism, it becomes impossible or even more difficult than usually in capitalism to make the type of investments that would enable us to plan and rationalize the consumption of Earth's resources in a sustainable way. So in the crisis of capitalism, we end up with the worst of both worlds. We can't grow the economy and we can't stop growing the consumption of the Earth, right? Now, the New Deals historically, the New Deal, the construction of the welfare state, etc., demand-side economics in general, what they were trying to deal with is only with the top part of the graph. They are trying to solve the issue of sustainability was not on the table. What they're trying to do is return to the moment, to the period where capitalism could just grow organically through private investment and returns on investment, consumption, etc. This was what New Deal is trying to do. The Green New Deal is trying to associate that with returning to sustainable consumption by way of making those investments. Well, just like the original New Deals and welfare states did large-scale investments, public investments, state investments in infrastructure, for example, the Green New Deal would make those investments in infrastructure again with the exact same benefits as before, creating public jobs, increasing the consumption capacity of the working class so that there is more commodities to circulate. Capitalists have more reasons to invest because they know that people will be able to buy their stuff. It will have all of the same benefits, but it will have another extra one, which is the investments that we're going to make in infrastructure are going to be to replace the existing unsustainable infrastructure with a sustainable version of it, right? Now, this sounds wonderful and we want to do that. However, we have a problem. And when we start looking at how capitalism operates at a structural level, like Marx did in his, like, as the apex of the kind of tradition of political economy and this critique of a political economy, we start realizing that capitalism actually has a very difficult time doing this, and that the New Deal will actually not solve this problem for us. The New Deal has two fundamental problems that we will return at the end, and we only understand how these problems work through Marx. Number one, even if it restores the rate of circulation and accumulation of capital, capital will only run into another economic crisis later on. Number two, because what you're doing is restoring capital will return to its expansionist drive, and eventually it will break the capacity of the state or any form of public interest to control its explosive growth, and it will return to a predatory consumption of Earth's resources. So the Green New Deal will actually not really solve the problem, not in the measure that it is green. The problem is not the green part. The problem is the New Deal part. It's limiting it to its New Deal capacity, to its demand side economics capacity. So from the point of view of Marx, this discussion where Keynes says in the long run we're all dead, well, Marxists read these differently. Marxists read this as actually Keynes commits the same sin as the neoclassical economists. He also is pushing the problem further down the road. He's kicking the can down the road, kind of a sentence we Marxists tend to say a lot when talking about capitalism. It's kicking the can down the road. It's resolving the crisis now, but it's not solving the structural problem that will give rise to a new crisis in the future. And in the context of the crisis of climate, it is not going to solve the need of capitalism to continuously expand more and more and more and more. So capitalism is just unsustainable if we read it through Marx's lens, and that's what we'll now start explaining. The point is we have the crisis. We've talked about lots of crises up till now. The crisis of 29, the crisis of 2008, an economic crisis becomes a political crisis. But there is another crisis we haven't really talked about yet, which is the crisis of the 1970s, which is the crisis that happens in the welfare state. It is a crisis of the welfare state. Keynes can't really explain that crisis. Only Marx can. And so that is what we will do. It was a gigantic crisis that cannot be ignored, and we will now understand why.
Okay, bear with me. I'm going to share my screen. That's looking good. That's working.
That's great.
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
Okay, at last, we made it to Marx. Time to talk about what we think is really going on. We're going to go through two major points of Marxian theory. The labor theory of value and the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It's a tongue twister, and I still haven't gotten used to it. But there you have it. Obviously, we're going to make a pretty simplified run through of these ideas. We're going to leave a couple of the complexities out. So this is not going to replace reading the actual sources and things, but hopefully this will give us a fairly intuitive look at the problem. We'll run through how Marx understood value, labor, profit, competition, and so forth. And this will all get us to a better idea of how crises occur in capitalism, which, as Rick mentioned, is due to the falling rate of profit. So after I run through this stuff, Rick is going to pick up again, actually, and go into more detail on the falling rate of profit, look at some of the empirical evidence, some of the historical evidence, connect the rate of profit to some of the things we've been talking about, like the welfare state, like the production of public housing, and the transition to neoliberalism. At that point, I think we'll have the proper context to return to our starting point, which is the unsustainability of capitalism, even under a Green New Deal program. Okay. All right, so Marx has a labor theory of value. Forms of this theory were developed by other political economists before him, classical political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Marx made important changes to their theory, as we'll see in a moment, but let's start with the fairly basic one. What is value, such that one would have like a labor theory of it? Let's begin with a simple object, like one of these sort of strange-looking apples as painted by Vincent van Gogh. And I hope there's some Dutch people in the audience that can appreciate that or cringe in disgust. An apple has a value for you if you are hungry. Maybe a steak would have more value, but an apple, makes a nice snack. At the same time, in order to acquire an apple, you'll probably have to go buy it in a shop. At the shop, the apple has a price, which is a value expressed in money. We call these two kinds of value use value and exchange value. Use value, the specific utility of something for what it is, an apple, what it is for you, an apple as food, versus its worth as a commodity to be exchanged for other commodities. For Marx, distinguishing between these two kinds of value, use value and exchange value, is crucial because capitalism itself distinguishes between them. Marx is not making just a moral argument of capitalism and how it thinks about things. It's trying to understand how capitalism works. So as you might expect, capitalism is really all about exchange value, the exchange value of commodities, the apple as a commodity. So we're mostly just going to ignore use value, but we'll come back to it later on. So where do these kinds of value come from? Let's go from the apple to the tree. The fruit tree bears fruit, obviously, so we can say that nature is the source of the fruit as fruit. We could say in general that nature is the source of all use values. Even like humans are part of nature, so nature is the source of humans. So nature ultimately is the source of labor too. But in order to exist, values still have to be produced. So you still have to find the tree, you still have to pick the fruit. It's only through the production of the value of the apple that you actually get to experience even its use value. Exchange value measures the amount of time that process takes, and it becomes the basis of trade. So we think about this amount of labor time as an average. The average amount of time depends on social and technical conditions. It's called socially necessary labor time. So up to this point, we haven't really moved beyond classical political economy, but things get interesting as Marx traces the commodity, in our example of the apple, back from the shop from where it was sold to the commercial orchard where it was produced. So what if harvesting apples is your job? What would that mean? People who do not have their own land are forced to sell their time, their labor, in order to make a living. In capitalism, they are paid in money for their time. So we can see that labor under capitalism becomes a commodity, and as a commodity, it has an exchange value. Realizing this point, understanding that capitalist relations turn labor into a commodity is Marx's big epistemological break that separates him from the previous classical political economists. This is what a Marxian labor theory value does differently. So what is the exchange value of labor? How much are workers paid and why? Marx says that workers are paid the full value of their labor. So it's not that labor is being bought at some artificially low price. But where does that price come from? As a baseline, that value is the cost of the means of subsistence of the worker, just enough money for the worker to feed and maintain themselves from one working day to the next. So this is, again, really simplified terms here. That's the baseline. So the cost, the value of labor, the exchange value of labor is basically enough money so that the worker can pay for the commodities that they need to consume in order to reproduce themselves as worker and continue to work. But the worker produces more in a day than that. They also produce surplus value above the value of their work. So in our basic example, a worker can harvest more apples in a day than they could consume. They're not that hungry. Even if they could clothe themselves with apples, build their home with apples, and live on apples alone, they're still producing more apples. Surplus value is appropriated by the employer as profit. Why does the employer get to do this? Because they own the land and trees. They own all the ladders, they own the baskets, they own the means of production. So if you have no means of production, if you have no capital in that sense, you have to go work for an employer. If you don't have your own orchard, you have to go work at the orchard. Or if there's no work in the orchard, you can move into town and try to get a job in a factory that makes ladders or baskets. So this simplified, we're skipping primitive accumulation and problems like that, but we can talk about that later if you want. Okay, so important to call out here that this is basically an exploitative relationship causing class conflict. The central contradiction in capitalism is between the social basis of production and the private accumulation of the surplus. So everybody in society is working, and capitalists are privately accumulating the profit themselves. That's the central and most basic kind of way to describe the contradiction in capitalism. And this causes a political struggle basically between capitalists and workers over what happens to that surplus, how much of it gets paid to the workers, how much is appropriated as profit, and so forth. Today, we're not going to go through the class struggle or the labor movement, really. It's just important to kind of call out and emphasize like the political dimension of political economy in this way. Okay, so back to surplus value. In order to become profit, surplus value must be realized through the sale of the commodities, the fruit harvest, in this case, in the market. So it's not enough that the orchard owner has a huge harvest of apples. They have to actually sell those apples to turn the apples into money. Then they can pay the workers a portion of that and have the rest as profit. But who is going to buy this harvest? The worker, as we've seen, is only paid enough money to buy the commodities they need to live until the next working day. Who will buy the rest of the harvest? Who will realize this surplus? This imbalance, basically the inability of workers to buy back from the capitalist the full product of their labor, like the difference between like what is profit here, is the profit basically relies on the inability of workers to actually consume. So profit is a contradiction here. At least this is the underconsumption theory of crisis. Since workers are paid less than the value that they produce, they will never be able to buy back the full product. So it ultimately will be impossible for the capitalist to actually turn their profit into money, to actually realize that surplus product as profit. This kind of theory of crisis, underconsumption, is an incomplete picture, but it does capture a lot of things, and a lot of Marxists of different kinds kind of focus on this, like David Harvey, I think, focuses on this. Luxemburg, I think, focused on this. We think it's an incomplete picture, but it's a good place to start in understanding capitalist crises. In order to fill out the theory, we need to move beyond apples. So let's consider also the ladders and baskets, other kinds of means of production, right? So the orchard workers are not the only workers in society, obviously. Other workers are producing things that capitalists buy, like the ladders and baskets that the orchard owner buys. And those workers, the workers working in that factory, they also eat apples. So the workers at the ladder and basket factory, maybe they can buy the rest of the apples. The capitalist that owns the orchard has therefore successfully realized the profit, and they can reinvest it in their orchard business by purchasing new means of production, new ladders and baskets from the factory owner. In this way, the orchard capitalist can move from profit into investment, and this is how accumulation happens. Through investment, the orchard owner can increase productivity. The orchard capitalist now has new and improved ladders that allow the workers to collect more apples with the same amount of labor time. The labor is now more productive. The means of production, we can see, of apples are not just the trees, but also the technological tools to work with those trees. Okay, but we're back to the same problem, right? Realization of profit. We're back in the market with even more fruit. Who is now going to buy this even larger surplus? Well, drawn to the town by all this burgeoning commerce, there's a new wheelbarrow factory. So its workers will buy the extra apples, and the orchard owner will now have another opportunity to reinvest in production, producing an even bigger surplus, and so forth. So you can basically see this is the exponential growth that capitalism depends on. You can see how it's problematic, obviously, from an environmental perspective. But putting aside that aspect now, this is also problematic just for capitalism, even without considering the externality, so-called externality, I guess, of the planet's limited resources. The need for growth is exponential, but the development of new, so this is one potential problem is technological. The need for growth is exponential, but the development of new tools may not be. If there's a delay, say, in like inventing the steam-powered wheelbarrow, then it's hard for the orchard capitalist to increase productivity, to accumulate further capital, and it breaks the cycle. But even before this, we may reach a problem. So let's go back to our original orchard owner. Why does the orchard owner invest in the first place? In our simplified model, we've seen how investing is basically a roundabout way of giving more money to more workers to be able to buy back the surplus. Why buy the latest ladders from the ladder factory if it's just a roundabout way to basically buy back your own apples through the workers in those other factories, right? If it's come to this ultimate point where the sort of circular nature of the problem has been realized, why bother? Well, basically because of intercapitalist competition. So if there's another orchard in the town producing apples as well, if our first capitalist doesn't want to go out of business, they have to increase productivity. They have to lower prices. They'll probably try to lower wages, and they'll do all this to stay competitive. And this is fine for the capitalist when the economy is growing and profit can be made from producing apples. But at a certain point, it becomes problematic. So I think we've sort of shown why rising productivity leads to falling profitability. Through this process of productivity growth, the orchards are producing more, the ladder factories are producing more factories are being produced by more factories, blah, blah. And they're all producing more relative to the workers they employ in the amount those workers can consume. This means that production has to expand faster and faster in order to maintain profitability. But the more it expands, the worse the situation becomes. This endgame becomes completely obvious, I think, when workers begin to be replaced by robots, like in this, I think is a Lamborghini factory. Robots obviously don't buy apples. They don't buy anything else for that matter. They produce no surplus value because they cannot realize any value. They can't be consumers. I think we should make an aside here, just that worker consumption, one of the things we haven't talked about is that worker consumption has also increased over this period, over this development process, largely due to the political struggle of workers for a larger share of the surplus, but also because capitalists are producing more and more, and there is just a larger surplus. From apples to steaks, from bicycles to cars, increased consumption has increased living standards, and to a certain extent has mitigated this kind of tendency towards crisis. But there is still an increasing disproportion between the consumer base and the commodities produced that need to be sold. This is basically overproduction. Overproduction is the flip side of underconsumption. And we're familiar with obvious cases of overproduction, like gluts, like excess milk being dumped. This is an example from 2020 in Idaho. The destruction of excess agricultural products, I think, is a famous and like a notorious example, given the famines in the world. But for Marx, general overproduction and simultaneously underconsumption are inevitable outcomes of the contradictions of capitalist production. But it's not as simple as the underconsumption or just the overproduction crisis we began with, or we talked about earlier, the rate of profit plays a more structural role in how this crisis builds. So you only see overproduction once the crisis has already happened. But even before you get there, there's a building crisis in the falling rate of profit. When there's a low profit rate, it's not in the capitalist interest to invest anymore. When profitability falls to a certain point, like there's no more money to be made in apples or ladders. Instead, they hoard the money or look for alternative ways to make a profit, like speculating on the stock market, on real estate, on NFTs, and so forth. And this is basically sort of the contemporary situation we're facing. This is financialization. This is fictitious capital. But before we get into all of that, Rick's going to go into more detail on the falling rate of profit.
Right. So,
Rick, you need to be unmuted. Yeah.
sorry, just getting the thing going. Okay. Falling rate. Oops, that's the wrong slide. There we go. There we go. Okay. So everyone is seeing the robot car factory, right? Cool. Yes, so let's step back for a little moment and talk about this. Like in this whole entire discussion, we haven't really talked about capital as a whole, right? Or rather, we have explained what capital consists of as a whole, but people tend to think of capital as like basically money often. Like if I was to just like ask you guys without telling you, what is capital? You would probably think it's kind of money. To a certain extent, that's how early bourgeois political economists like Adam Smith saw capital. Like it's the default state of capital is money. And that's how capitalists think of capital as well. But the fundamental, that's one of the main like shifts that Marx produces on bourgeois political economy, is to focus away from the act of trading the thing and getting money in return for it, to the act of producing the thing. For Marx, capital is the entire system. So the money that is used to trade the apples is capital, but so are the apples themselves are also capital. The labor used to produce the apples is capital. The ladders and the trees are capital. The labor that was used in the past to produce the ladders is capital. If all of this is capital, the capital is the entirety of the system of production and circulation of wealth. And in Marx specifically, and that is the key point, when you focus on the act of production of the commodity and not in the moment of trading it and it being consumed by whoever buys it, when you focus away from trade and consumption, where Adam Smith up to Ricardo to a certain extent were focused on, and you move to focusing on production, which is a trend. It wasn't just Marx didn't do the shift to production. It was a trend. Ricardo was already making the shift, right? But Marx is the one that really kind of realizes, no, it's all about the act of production. And when you understand that, all capital is labor. Everything is labor. And it's the labor that people are doing in the current productive cycle to get apples from the trees, right? But it's also the labor that previous workers in previous productive cycles have accumulated in the form of the means of production. What do I mean by this? It's the ladders, it's the baskets, it's the wheelbarrows, it's the robots. All of that is also labor. It's labor done by workers in the past, right? And so in this logic, Marx makes a distinction between two types of capital, variable capital and constant capital. Now, we're not going to explain why one is called variable and the other is called constant, but point is variable capital is the labor that workers are doing in each moment of the productive cycle. Constant capital is the means of production, which is labor in the past. Sometimes this is also referred to as living labor, labor that is being done now, and dead labor, labor that is like basically put inside the box. You need to think about like means of production, ladders, wheelbarrows, robots that paint cars by themselves. All of that is workers of the past put labor inside the box. Think of it in kind of conceptual terms, right? And the workers in the present open that box and take labor out of it and use that labor to complement their own, to increase their productivity in the present. And they keep taking labor out of that box until like the ladder breaks and you need to build a new one. The box is empty, right? In conceptual terms, think of it this way. So everything is labor. All past labor of past generations is accumulated in the contemporary means of production we have today. So let's go back to the beginning of Will's story, but in a kind of a slightly more abstract way. We have workers collecting apples from the trees. In this mechanism, in this logic of variable and constant capital, the labor that workers are doing to get the apples from the trees is all variable capital, and that variable capital corresponds directly to the apples you get, right? Now, capitalism never actually worked this way because capitalism didn't start with the beginning of human civilization. It started later. So when capitalism appears historically, there's already a lot of constant capital. Wheelbarrows have already been invented when capitalism appears. But let's simplify everything. We don't need to think about, we don't want to talk about primitive accumulation and the transition into capitalism historically. We can leave that for something next year or something. Now let's simplify. Let's pretend, right? We have variable capital V making apples. But as Will explained, the capitalist does not pay the workers the entire amount of money that corresponds to how much he can sell the apples for. Or in other words, the workers are not paid the money value of all of the apples they have produced. They are only paid part of it, and they can only buy back part of the apples. The rest is what is called surplus value. The apples which value is not paid to the workers is surplus value. Now, the rate between surplus value S and variable capital V is what is usually called rate of surplus value or rate of exploitation, because this is the exploitation of labor. The workers have produced all the apples, but the capitalist only pays them a part of them. And as Will was explaining as well, this money capital that the capitalist gets by selling the apples that he didn't pay the workers for, he is invested in buying the ladders and the baskets from the ladder and basket factory. So now we start having constant capital. This is the labor of the workers in the ladder factory in the orchard, right? We have constant capital. Now, constant capital increases productivity because it's added work, the added labor that is used in the present, the labor from the past transferred into the present. And what we have then is the capitalist has more surplus value that they can use to buy the wheelbarrows. And then after buying the wheelbarrows, they have even more, and they buy a steam-powered wheelbarrow, and then they buy a steam-powered ladder, and so on and so forth, right? So the system keeps expanding like this. So what I want you to, this is just a more abstract version of the story Will told you with the orchard example. But I want you to focus on these two things. The rate of, can everyone see my mouse? Is my mouse seeable? Like the rate between surplus value here. The rate between surplus value and variable capital is called rate of surplus value or rate of exploitation. The proportion of constant capital in relation to variable capital is called the organic composition of capital. These are two very important rates. And as you see, both rates increase over time. Now, you're already intuiting a kind of the fundamental problem here, I think, from Will telling the story in concrete terms and me telling it in abstract terms, is that the rate of exploitation tends to increase, and the rate of and the organic composition of capital tends to increase as well. However, they do not increase at the same rate. Now, I'm going to explain exactly how this works in detail, but the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall that Marx concludes as basically the most important law of capitalism. which has several representations, and it can be fairly complicated to properly interpret it. We're not going to go into it in detail, but the point is that this is what you need to extract and kind of, I suppose, accept for now. If you want to read more about it, we can direct you to that. The rate of surplus value keeps increasing, but the organic composition of capital keeps increasing even more, which means, and profit depends on that. Profit only comes from human labor because it only comes from surplus value that is only produced by human labor in the present, not by human labor in the past, which means that as you accumulate more and more and more constant capital, the rate of profit tends to decline. Which this kind of incredibly counterintuitive paradox of capitalist production is that the more wealth is accumulated, the more technological means you have, the more apples you can produce, the less is the rate of profit that capitalists can extract from the economic system as a whole, right? So how are we gonna, how do you solve that problem? Well, in many ways you kind of don't. Economists are even kind of managing to figure out ways of measuring the rate of profit historically. In the past, using like statistical methods and like gathering data in different ways. This is a graph of the rate of profit, the world rate of profit since 1869, done by Marxist economist Michael Roberts. Author of several books, and he keeps a very interesting blog that if you want to see like the current state of things, he likes to constantly publish stuff there in his blog on the current problem. You can see here the rate of profit declining over time since the like sort of mid-19th century up until today. But it has interesting variations that we need to look at a little bit. So you have a kind of an increased fall of the rate of profit in the second half of the 19th century, roughly. It's very easy to understand this in the context of Will's presentation and mine up till now. It's industrialization, right? More machines, more productivity, lower rate of profit. This leads into a massive crisis, which is usually called a long depression. In this context, capitalist competition is heightened, is radicalized. Capitalists need to kind of figure out ways of getting easy profits. And the way they do that in this time is basically to try and steal the profits from other capitalists. In this context, this is capitalist colonial empires trying to steal the sources of cheap labor in the colonies from other colonial empires. That's World War I, and I mean several conflicts that happened throughout the end of the 19th century, but certainly World War I and then World War II are the manifestations of this, what happens when capitalism trying to fix this problem. Now, the thing about war is that war has two interesting characteristics at an economic level. Number one, it's very profitable because there are no limits to production. The state is trying to win the war, and it just buys all of the war machines from capitalists. All of the war machines are also commodities, but the state buys all of them to just buy bombs and blow stuff up with the bombs, right? There's no limit to how many bombs you need until the end of the war. It's constant injection, constant production of money by the state to give to capitalists to buy their bombs, to blow the stuff from other states in order to win the war. So profit rates are very high during war. But war has another issue, which is after the war, a lot of stuff has been blown up by the bombs, the bombs that are commodities, right? There's a lot of destruction of physical stuff. This physical stuff is constant capital. It's the bladders, the wheelbarrows, the robots, the machines, what war destroys, I mean, it kills people as well. It also destroys variable capital, but it destroys constant capital more. And what you have after the long period of kind of large-scale war in the first half of the 20th century is that you are left with a lot of destruction, material destruction. So you have a sort of restoration of variable capital mattering more in the general equation in comparison to constant capital. There's a lot of constant capital to rebuild cities, rebuild factories, rebuild everything. Reconstruction is enormously good business, and it solves the problem of the rate of profit temporarily. This is the period of the welfare state. And you can see here this dumping here, like here in the middle is the Great Depression, because World War I did not destroy enough stuff, so we needed World War II afterwards. The New Deal didn't really pick up in the period after the crisis of 1929. New Deals and welfare states only really picked up after World War II. And it is because of this high rate of profit, that this restoration of the rate of profit through the destruction of constant capital by the war. However, this doesn't end there, because the rate of profit continues to fall under the welfare state. The capitalists have a lot of profits for a while. They can use part of those profits to increase the wages of the workers or to give housing to poor people. The workers at this point are politically very angry because they didn't like dying in the war. They're the ones that died in the war. They're very angry. There's a Soviet Union on the other side saying socialism, and we don't have economic crisis here, at least at the time that was true. And so there's a lot of pressure from below. And capitalists can give the workers part of their profits because they have a very high rate of profit at that time. But as they rebuild more, as you rebuild the factories, as you rebuild the cities, as you start accumulating constant capital again, you run into the crisis again. You run into the crisis of the 1970s. The crisis of the welfare state is not qualitatively different from the crisis of liberal capitalism before the welfare state or afterwards. It's the crisis of the accumulation of constant capital. It's the crisis of the organic composition of capital. It's the crisis of profitability that is inevitable in capitalism. Neoliberalism, we've already seen this in the previous session, solves this by cutting public spending, privatizing, injecting public part of the economy into the private economy in order to use that as a source of profit. It cuts wages or stagnates wages and replaces them with, and this is an extremely interesting thing, which is you can't sell your apples now anymore in the 70s. You can't sell the apples as a capitalist. No one can buy. You produce enormous amounts of apples and there's not enough people to buy them. What do? You start selling, letting the workers buy apples, not with the money you've paid them as salaries, but with the money you're going to pay them in the future, with future money, salary money. Or in other words, you give them a credit card. You start replacing salaries with credit, with debt. And that's how you have the debt bubble exploding since the 1970s to solve the crisis of profitability that is happening in welfare state capitalism. The growth of GDP in the United States here, and the growth of like the real economy, and the growth of the debt market. This is money circulating in the economy as credit. Of course, the problem is that then you create this dissociation between the amount of money circulating in the economy as credit and the real economy. And that runs into a moment when the financial sector realizes this problem. It realizes it can't get a return on their credit investments because people will not be able to buy back their debt. Now it's not apples anymore that people are buying. People are buying money in exchange for future money, but it will never be repaid. So you have again the crisis in 2008. This is the global corporate profits during this period, and you can see that they're already going into the negative, or rather, this is the increase, the rate at which profits increase. Profits have stopped increasing, have started decreasing since 2018, before coronavirus. So in the context of coronavirus, it's even worse. It's already blowing, everything was already blowing up again. And now it's going to be even worse. This is the same graph I started with, the rate of profit, but only since 1950 and only for the G20 countries. And this, by the way, is the production of housing. Public sector is the darker red one, and this the bottom lighter one is private sector housing in the UK. And you can see how the production of housing and the profitability of capitalism essentially matches, go more or less hand in hand. Although it's important to understand not just total quantity, but the ratio between public and private production. The turn to the neoliberalism means getting rid of the public sector housing and putting it all in private sector, because precisely you're replacing salaries with credit. You need people to contract mortgages on housing to buy their houses. And so that's why you switch everything to private and eliminate the public, right? So this is the situation where we are now. So this is where we are going to conclude. We have two fundamental problems of talking about a New Deal in the current moment. Number one problem, reconstructing the welfare state or doing a New Deal requires, historically, it's been demonstrated, it requires a moment when you have high rates of profit that were historically created by the destruction of constant capital by war. Now you look at this, right? Look at this graph. What is the part of this graph that is more similar to the current one? What is the most similar part to the neoliberal part of the graph? It's this one. Did you get a welfare state solving this problem historically? No. You have a welfare state solving the problem only after a massive amount of destruction of constant capital caused by World War I and II. So you are not going to get a New Deal unless you have a massive destruction of constant capital accumulated today. You need to wait for World War III to then get the New Deal. New Dealism is not going to be possible to do. This is conclusion number one of Marxist analysis of the problem. Conclusion number two is the one we started with. Even if you manage to do it, you are going to run into the same problems that the original New Deals and welfare states ran into. You are going to run into a moment when crisis will assert itself again, capital growth will collapse again because of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And as a consequence of that, there will be less capacity of capital to accept longer-term investments. They will default to short-term investments, and therefore we'll start consuming more and more Earth's resources again. So even if the Green New Deal works, it will only work for a bit. It is not sustainable, right? And this is where we're ending. This thing that you're looking at here, this is essentially the difference that Will started with when he was discussing the concept of value, the difference between exchange value and use value. Capitalism does not work on the basis of use value. It works in the basis of exchange value. Exchange value defines its fundamental logics of growth. What you need to do to solve this problem is find a way of having an economy that runs not on exchange values, but on use value, so that you can make rational decisions on the basis of what resources you have and what you want to do with them, without needing to obey the infinite growth logic of the markets, and without needing to obey the crisis logics of the rate of profit falling, right? For that, you need to find a system that moves away from the market dynamics, and this is where the difference between reform and revolution enters the equation. You need to do a planned economy to rationalize production and reach sustainable consumption. And that requires an entirely new mode of production, which is not capitalism. The welfare state / New Deal will not be enough. We end in pessimism.
Happy news. Thank you. Thank you, Rick. Okay, so thank you both for great presentations and explanations. I don't know if there are any questions. You can raise your hand or put it on the chat, or maybe comments. It's not a presentation. Questions. The situation is more like of a discussion. So someone saying thank you on the chat. Maybe one question to discuss, which is more also relevant to architectural students, is how we see labor theory value to be being played out in nowadays in architecture, both in terms of architectural production, so producing architectural commodities, but also in relation to labor. So how the labor relations in architecture, especially with let's say the constant innovation of means of production can be thought. Any ideas on that? Any comments? And then Doug has his hand up. Yeah, so we can. I'm talking to both Will and Rick, and or maybe we move into. Can you speak?
You wanna go, Will? I was already speaking for like at least a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a big and complicated question with a number of different aspects. I have a feeling Doug may want to address this in some way. What do you think, Doug?
Don't know. I've got many thoughts on this, so I'll just pick one. I mean, just some things I want to kind of get off my chest are that I absolutely appreciate the clarity with which the kind of essential ideas of Marx and his critique of political economy are presented. And appreciate, of course, that I'm not saying anything to be critical of you not going into depth, because, you know, we could be here for years doing that. But I also do just think it's useful to understand capital in the way that Marx does in his so-called more mature phase, as it's not even just all the things. It's a kind of, it's immaterial. It's value in motion, value in process, as he calls it, which assumes different forms. So at one moment it's in circulation, in another moment it's in profit, in another moment it's in labor, in another moment it's a building, in another moment it's a building that makes people into happy consumers like a shopping mall does. So I think those things are important. What I wanted to say mostly, though, was that in relation to the Green New Deal, planning, the inevitability of capital to fail, even in its own terms, and the questions about the relationship between reform and revolution, that, yeah, I'm with you that the Green New Deal in itself is not enough, and it's not an answer that is permanent. But my position is always, you know, to keep the revolutionary in mind and to keep the goal in mind, but also to talk about, but not to let the planet burn while you're waiting for the revolution to happen. So reform has a place. Yeah, and I think working with the state and through the state has a necessary place in that. So yeah, I think there is much to be said that's critical of the Green New Deal from many perspectives, but that it is a move that's, I think, also especially pertinent for architecture and design, because it does attempt to reverse the relationship since the late 70s between architecture and the economy, where architecture then would have a relationship with planning and then necessarily have a relationship with other industries and other practices like the construction industry and maybe construction workers as well. So I think that's my kind of brief take on my position on the Green New Deal, is that I think it's important not to, whilst we can rightly understand its limitations, is not to fall into kind of despair that produces inaction entirely, kind of while we're waiting for the revolution to happen. But I also think this, what's also critical, one more point, is that the Green New Deal means working with the state, and it does mean a return to planning. This is very different, I think, from, and even your like revolutionary program means planning of society. This is very different from Vivek Chiba's position, which is a partial inclusion of a market economy. So it's for that reason, and he was kind of alluding to these kind of controversies, but this is the reason why some people say that he's not a Marxist, and his position is essentially that of a social democrat.
Yeah, that is a very interesting tension in Vivek's work that I haven't studied too much that I'd want to comment on it, but it does seem like he emphasizes class struggle historically, in his assessment of developmental states. But then the role of class struggle in the production of a new socialist state or a new developmental state is a little bit more vague. So the distinction between a bourgeois-led developmental state historically and a worker-led market socialist state now is hard to pick out, basically. Yeah. But putting that aside for now, I think your point about the Green New Deal and staying positive and like how to actually productively and like positively work on the problem is really well taken. And I don't think, I mean, Rick's kind of pessimistic point at the end is not supposed to be meant as really as full pessimism. It's more like we need to understand, I mean, we also basically support the Green New Deal. And I think in architecture, it's very clear that whether there's a Green New Deal or a socialist transformation, architects will be doing fairly similar things. It'll just be the larger political economy of those changes outside the discipline that will change. So as far as the discipline is concerned, architects should be very interested in the Green New Deal, what kinds of things it's suggesting, because regardless of reform or revolution, the disciplinary role is probably fairly similar. And this was the argument we tried to make in our symposium, that reform and revolution for architecture is basically, there's no strategic difference really for us for what architects should be doing. But I think the point Rick was trying to make regarding pessimism is just that our read, like the Marxist structural read, is that capital will not give you like the Green New Deal is still a capitalist-led reform. And due to low profit rates, capitalism is more resistant to making those reforms than it was when the original New Deal and the original welfare state happened. That means that we have to be prepared for a more aggressive, confrontational political struggle to get those reforms. Basically, that getting those, like, this is sort of explaining why, despite all the seemingly rational suggestions made by recent left movements, which seem to synthesize capitalist interests with working class interests, like why neo-Keynesianism just seems like such common sense, it's still being rejected, basically. And people like Bernie Sanders or Corbyn, who are making the case to capital of the positive effects of like increased demand, are still being rejected. So maybe this is a topic that we should have another session on, which is just like the difference between strategy and tactics and the tension between strategy and tactics, which I think is really interesting and fundamental.
Yeah, can I come in?
Yeah, you pick up, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like our position is that everyone needs to fight as hard as they can for a Green New Deal. Like the Green New Deal is unambiguously a good thing, but we need to understand, and this is why Marx can contribute to this discussion. This is what we're saying. The Green New Deal is limited, and what it will enable doing will, I mean, if it succeeds temporarily, but worse than that, it probably won't. Capitalism does not have the current conditions to give it to us, but it doesn't mean we need to start like saying the Green New Deal is bullshit. We need to stop fighting for it or even start fighting against it. That would be complete lunacy. This is where tactics comes in, right? Precisely because, as a Marxist, I believe that there will be no Green New Deal. There will not be a Green New Deal. Capitalism does not have the profit rate to accept a New Deal framework today. But precisely because of that, I don't see any reason not to fight for it even more, because the fight to produce those reforms will reach a point where it becomes clear that the fight for a Green New Deal eventually becomes a fight for a green revolution. Because if capital systematically does not give it to you, eventually you'll start fighting you stop fighting to convince capital to give it to you, and you'll start fighting to get rid of capital in order to do it yourself. The reformist struggle transforms into a revolutionary struggle if the reform is not implemented at the necessary pace. We have a historical precedent. We had moderate New Deal-y, welfare statey, proto-welfare statey attempts before World War I and more even after 29 before World War II, but they did not solve the problem. Capitalism was not able to afford welfare state solutions at a sufficient level of scale and radicality to solve the problem. Only after World War II was it possible. So I do think that we will actually probably see a little moderate, timid, like bits of the Green New Deal happening here and there, but it will not be at a systemic scale that it is necessary unless World War III happens in the meantime, and then after World War III we get it. But I would rather avoid that. So the problem at the tactical level is we need to fight as hard as we can to basically, the issue that we have is either we're going to have war first and then the Green New Deal after that, or we're going to have revolution first and then we don't need the war. Capitalism will not have the need for war. We will get rid of the problem before war happens, right? So we at the strategy to tactics level, that I think is the way a Marxist thinks. So fight for the Green New Deal as hard as you can. And not only that, at the technical level, what professionals and scientists and researchers, etc., can contribute, even while it's not being done, but what the progress that can be made on the technical aspect of the Green New Deal needs to be made. Like the more progress is made now, all of the architects doing work on the Green New Deal right now are doing incredibly valuable work, even if it's not going to be put in practice at the necessary scale, right? That work needs to continue being done because it's going to serve as a blueprint for whatever solution eventually comes at the political level, right? I think that's what I wanted to say. There was something else, but I forgot now. Yeah, I'll come back. Oh, and people were asking. Okay, I'll be done now.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions in relation to architecture.
Oh, I know.
Sorry.
I know what it was. It's connected to the last question on planning, on the issue of planning, right? I don't think it's very useful to anticipate at the theoretical level if you can have 100% planning or only 80% or only 50% and the rest is markets. How much planning can work by itself or how much markets need to contribute because planning can't actually do everything. When we're talking about we need large-scale planning, planned economy, it doesn't necessarily mean automatically like that there cannot be like a little cafe on the corner which functions as a small business as part of kind of a small scale. Like it doesn't automatically mean that. It can mean that or not. I don't know, but I don't think it makes any sense to try and like figure out in theoretical terms what is the percentage of like planning to markets. What makes sense is to understand that whatever the outcome in every situation historically is a product of the process of the historical struggle to construct the alternative economic model. It's the struggle itself that ends up determining how much markets, how much planning, etc. exist, how much democracy exists in the workplace, in the context of the market part of the system, and in the context of the planned part of the system. Like these are all historical problems that Marxists and communists and revolutionaries in general have, right? But these are kind of outcomes of the political process of the struggle itself, of revolution. Predicting it in theoretical terms to say, no, we can have 100% planning and no need for any markets or not. I mean, maybe there is a kind of theoretical interest to that discussion, but generally I'm not in that field. And I just think that in political work, we don't really need to worry about it. What we need to do is to struggle for the proletariat to take power. Then we'll see in the context of that struggle, what happens afterwards, right?
Philip, do you want to contribute, say something?
Sure, but I think there are 2 or 3 questions in the chat before me. So
yes. You're right. Yeah, so there were a couple of questions in regard to the role of architecture in that. So one is by Kathleen, how can young architects find ways of making a change to our field towards a better future? And I think Tal is making also a point about she's writing, given the planned economy has systematically failed on a national level and was historically achieved by curtailing personal liberties, what is your solution? It would be interesting to trace similar economic analysis of alternative examples. What is the role of architecture to play here? So again, the role of architecture within this this situation, and yeah. And one more, maybe I'll say that and finish there. How do you continue to convince people who is unable to accept this Marxist view and still believe that is able to be good within capitalism, even after watching this this lecture? So, yeah, one is the role of architecture. The second thing is how people change views, I guess. Anyone who wants to pick up on that or discuss it?
Do you want to respond to any of those, Eleni?
I think the role of architecture. I mean, there's this is why I brought it also in the beginning as of the discussion. What is the role of architecture on that? Because I think we can use what you presented today to discuss both. To start viewing both our labor relations within the profession, how we practice, how we, as academics, but also as architects, where this value is produced, what kind of value do we produce when we work, in what kind of means of production we engage with, and so I think it is important to start bringing these theories not only on the political level but also in our everyday engagement with the profession. And of course, there is the issue of the commodities that we produce, and which is of course it has to do with how we continue the battles in political level and change that, at least in certain fields, but also in educating ourselves and fighting politically to change certain the access we have in certain things like education and housing and all that. So yeah, I don't know if that helps at all, but or anyone has any other ideas, better ideas. No?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think young architects. Yeah, I mean, the point, especially that we focused on in the symposium, was shifting the idea of architectural agency over these questions from the project to the larger social context. So young architects, if a young architect wants to basically be part of a Green New Deal, then they should be part of the political struggle for that outside of the discipline. Like they should be involved in politics. They should be involved in organizing. So I think it's part of our emphasis and the way, and we definitely emphasize like the material character of these relations to emphasize that architects practicing in capitalist contemporary society are structurally incapable of focusing on values other than profit. The building industry, the architecture market, such as it exists, just focuses on profit, period, basically, with some limited examples around the margins. So in order to change that, young architects should, I think, in a fairly optimistic and like positive and courageous way, start getting involved in politics and organization outside of architecture or inside of architecture through, as Eleni said, the organization of architects as workers. So the production of exchange value in the discipline becomes a site of struggle over the surplus and all that.
Rick, would you like to say something on that?
I think everything was answered. Only with this one point by Talbar on how to address the problem of like historical planned economies and their failure, right? Especially in the context of, well, this was historically achieved by curtailing personal liberties. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like revolutions are complicated. and transformation of society from a market economy into a planned one, regardless of there still being bits of it that are market-driven or not, components of it that are markets, but controlled markets, planned, themselves subjected and subsumed by a kind of planning that can be more or less democratic. I mean, these are very complicated discussions in political terms, but I think they're important to acknowledge. But the point that I think needs to be made is that like revolutions are very complicated and they involve repression, and undoubtedly. I don't think it's possible to do one without it. That's also why they're relatively rare. Like people only engage in a revolution when the situation is really so bad that they feel that they have very little to lose. The point is that the capitalist markets lead to all of these issues first. Revolution happens when the evils of revolution are already present under capitalism. That's my theory, at least. Revolution has evils, many of them, but it unblocks the situation that it can become better in the future. But it has evils in the short run. Usually it only happens when those evils are already present under capitalism. And this is what we see, like the systematic tendency towards crisis produces evils, produces misery and poverty. It produces a lot of anger among the working classes that are increasingly immiserated as when capitalism goes into crisis, which triggers repressive responses by capitalism, usually called fascism. Fascism is just a tactic of political management of capitalism to maintain free markets running. Fascism is not the state taking over everything, by the way. It's exactly the other way around. It's maintaining the control of the economy by the big capitalist monopolies. In fact, the largest implementation of, like the first large-scale implementation of neoliberal economic policies in the world was done in Chile after 1973 by a fascist regime that was created in Chile in order to be able to politically forcefully implement neoliberal policies. Privatization happened at a large scale in the neoliberal context under fascism, right? So it's to maintain the rule of the monopoly capitalist class. So all of the problems all of this repression, all of the misery, all of the short-term clear problems that a socialist transition can have and has historically had, happen under capitalism. And that's when things are that bad, that's when people decide, okay, I've got nothing to lose, might as well do the revolution. That is kind of how historically how this thing operates.
There was another question we didn't really answer on how to convince people who are not ready to become Marxists. Yeah, I think
it's a struggle, the ongoing struggle. People are convinced by the experience of the crisis.
Yeah, exactly. And people who need certain things, like if people are not convinced by the Marxist reading, but they are convinced by the good of a Green New Deal, they're involved in that struggle, and maybe at some point in the process, they'll radicalize further. But there's also, I think, obviously people who are structurally unconvincible, people for whom they have no interest, it's not in their interest at all to be a Marxist. And this is why, despite the explanatory power of Marx's original Critique of Political Economy, it was basically buried by like 2 centuries of neoclassical economics that tried to ignore all the points that he made. So it's a struggle.
I think there is one more question before we. It says interested in. Yes. I think that was before. This is why I address it now. Interested if you could more specifically situate your intents or hopes with this work. Why here? Why now? I think because it is the right moment, and because we have the let's say the luxury of, let's say, having this discussion and having the platform and having the opportunity. So why not? No, it's necessary, I think.
Yeah, and this discussion is happening in a conversation like this is happening all over the place right now, and started to happen increasingly after the financial crash in 2008, when the dominance of neoclassical orthodox economics basically went into complete crisis, and then all the economic, all the political crises of liberalism that followed that. And in specifically in the discipline of architecture, this is something we talked about with Doug, especially in the symposium. There's an increasingly class consciousness of architecture students, of young architects and architecture workers. So this experience, this like coming face to face with the material relations of production in architecture also creates the conditions for having this conversation historically.
Yeah. Philip, would you like to pose your question? Sorry for the delay.
Sure. No, thank you. No, it's all right. Yeah, I think, well, first of all, a short comment regarding the pessimism and optimism in the comments. I think, I mean, I largely agree with your analysis, your Marxist framework and everything, but I think that makes me more optimistic because I think, there's a certain clear-sightedness that once you clear away all your kind of illusions, I think it's easier to be optimistic. At least that's how I feel. So I don't think this is a pessimistic conclusion at all. But my question, perhaps disguised as a comment or the other way around, is kind of, I think positing the Green New Deal as a kind of static object is a bit problematic because you can have many different Green New Deals. And I think many of them are not worth fighting for. I mean, one example pertaining to architecture is, Bjarke Ingels, BIG's master planet kind of scheme. It's not explicitly a Green New Deal scheme, but it kind of touches upon it. And I think many Green New Dealers would kind of look upon it as something that they would like to achieve as well. And he has some sort of like planetary integration of energy systems, et cetera, et cetera. But one big problem is that he kind of assumes that the living standards of current day Singapore is kind of the ideal. And that would require an energy consumption that is enormously more vaster than it is today. And that point on energy consumption, for example, is not really discussed in the Green New Deal framework very often. So I think, which Green New Deal it is that you're talking about really, really matters. A high energy consumption Green New Deal is not going to be possible. And it's going to require a lot of resources, rare earth minerals, et cetera, et cetera. People are very aware of this today, I think. It's not going to be a very nice outcome. So that's just something I want to say within the context of this discussion.
Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well put and really important. Like it's very important to look at what are we actually talking about when architecture appears with this aspect of transitioning to sustainability, right? But then again, I actually think the framework of the Green New Deal is sufficient to be able to detect this difference. Like, if it's not framed as a macroeconomic transformation in a substantial way that even like socializes part of the production, as I was talking about in my presentation on Friday in the symposium, the new welfare state mechanisms do socialize part of production. If it's not framed in that way, it's probably, it may be green, but it's not exactly a New Deal. And the greenness of it is, there are a lot of like specifically like neoliberal green projects out there. In the sense that there's a kind of an acceptance of the system breaking in the future. And what you do is kind of, the projects appear with this image of green fortresses for the ruling class to hide, that are sustainable as a microsystem, but they're not part of a macro transformation of the economic, political economic machinery of human civilization. So the mass, like you look at these Bjarke Ingels green sustainable cities, and they are going to be, there might as well be like space stations or etc. The point is that they're sustainable microsystems, and then what is not part of the drawings of the renderings is this kind of gigantic like wasteland around them, with all of the poors living in hovels, in abject misery and climatic catastrophe happening to them, right? That's the part that isn't shown, but it's an inevitable component of those imageries.
There is a discussion going on in the chat in regard to the first point that Tal made about the limitations of personal freedom by state planning and the failures of the past of state planning, and I think.
Yeah, I don't think this is the time to have that full debate. There would be disagreements between multiple. Like I think Rick and I will disagree with Doug's take. Eleni, maybe I don't know. It would be a complicated discussion.
I think there are different forms of planning which we need to discuss. Yeah.
We're not here to debate socialism historically. But maybe that's an interesting thing to discuss another time. We don't want to not have that discussion. It's just bigger than this event. But I think Talpar added a point about Mariana Mazzucato, the sort of MMT. Yeah, and I think this point gets to Philip's point as well, is that even within the sort of Keynesian framework, there are debates around multiple versions of that. So there's like classical Keynesians, there's sort of neoliberal Keynesians that just understand it in Keynes in very limited terms. There's post-Keynesians that base their theory on Kalecki. There's MMT, obviously, is a big thing now as kind of a new version. Our position is that all these different theories more or less miss the underlying dynamics of value. MMT does not have a theory of value. Keynes doesn't have a theory of value. And MMT specifically focuses on money as basically an autonomous product of the state. And from a Marxist perspective, that's just a fantasy. It all comes down to actual production, not just like currency voluntarism, basically. But this is again just way bigger than today's event to talk about these debates. There is a review, I think, of Mazzucato's book on Michael Roberts' blog. People can check out if they want a fairly straightforward response.
Oh, and by the way, I actually think, like as I was saying, that there were timid attempts to produce sort of proto-New Deal, proto-welfare state mechanisms before the end of World War II. I do think MMT is precisely one of these today, like a contemporary equivalent of these. It's a sort of new Keynesianism that says we don't actually even need to kind of socialize part of production. It's enough to just essentially kind of inject, solve the problem through monetary policy. That is precisely, it's kind of a retreat from Keynes into a kind of lighter version. I generally, in my framework, I would say it's a good example of the types of limited timid Keynesianism that might be implemented today, as opposed to actual welfare state construction, like it was in the 40s to 70s. Those are the Keynesianisms that might be possible to do in the current moment, but they will not solve the problem, just like the New Deal did not prevent World War II.
I think there's a question from Jean. I don't know if I pronounce the name. You have raised your hand. Would you like to? Oh, and we need to. We need to unmute you. Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes. Hi.
Thank you so much for your brilliant series of events. Thank you. And my intervention is going to not in any way sort of reach the level at which you've kind of pitched what you've delivered. But I'm a filmmaker who came out of the London Filmmakers Collective, a history in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And I think this history sort of feeds very much in with, for example, the way I would, we were very conscious of this working as filmmakers, as a collective. we were really thinking what we were doing through Marx's theory of value. And I'm just thinking, for instance, just to make myself eloquent about this, thinking of the kind of diagrams that David Harvey has produced over the last years with his work on Marx's theory of valorization. And what we understood we were doing was to actually intervene in that circuit of capitalist valorization. So in very simple ways, like owning the means of production, transforming the relations of production, transforming the division of labor, producing something that didn't conform to what was being produced in the mainstream of oligarchic cinema. For instance, standardization, idealization, specialization, for instance, going against that, but rather reading and looking at aesthetics of hunger coming from Latin America, or Spinoza's imperfect cinema. So seeing underdevelopment, imperfection, aesthetics of hunger, or arte pauvre, poor means, as being more interesting, more as art than the kinds of stuff that was being produced by the oligarchies. Then realizing we needed, in order to do this, to produce a different kind of audience. And this involved theory, and this involved producing a new audience through theorizing in a critical way, in the way that you're doing it now, and then having alternative forms of distribution. And this was, we saw this as very much intervening in all the apparatuses of jouissance that are present in capitalist valorization. And I think that what we produced at that time, and the sort of legacy of all of that, is still important as part in the archive. So I just wanted to share this because, you know, I know that there's so much more to this in relation to what you've produced, but I just wanted to sort of say this was a very material and very concrete way in which we kind of tried to take on capitalist valorization and actually produce interventions, and I think we did. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Doug is saying that is really interesting. So you know, Doug, of the work.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Jean, that's a kind of side conversation you and I might have. But I was taught by Sylvia Harvey, who wrote May '68 and Film Culture, very much about. I think she mentions the London Film Collective, but she's looking at the situation in France primarily. But I think at the same time, I think what you say is a really interesting example of how people working in culture might contribute to these kind of struggles.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I think we have past time. It's already 45 past 2. So maybe it's a good point, if there is no any urgent questions, to bring that to an end. And
we didn't fully respond to, I think, Sven's point about other forms of theory and their contributions. And I just wanted to
I'm sorry, I missed some questions.
There's a lot going on in the chat, I think. But yeah, there are so many other dimensions to this that we obviously haven't covered. And we'd like to, I mean, our idea originally was to make this kind of first fairly simple, we tried to make it simple and limited intervention on political economy in order to be able to go off and talk more like next year about more of the specific connections to other struggles, other histories. So there's some huge topics we haven't really discussed. I think we've mentioned them a bit, but we haven't talked about colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism. We haven't talked about the relationship between gender and labor. We haven't talked about reproductive labor. We haven't talked about racial capitalism. There's a lot of things still to talk about, and we think those are all relevant, and we'd like to talk about them as soon as possible, basically.
Yeah, the point of this cycle that we actually sort of wanted initially to do in the second term of this academic year was that on the basis of that we could establish a kind of a little work group with interested people at the AA. where we could start doing some work on having more specific discussions on more specific points, articulating it more clearly with architectural practice, etc., and so on. But so ideally, what we would really like is to be able to start doing that with a work group, a study group in the first term of the next academic year, with all the students that might be here today and follow the cycle that will be in the school next year. And then more specific events, well, point by point on different issues, different points, different contributions.
But if you would be interested to receive an email, when we start creating that, you can put your emails on the chat, and I will try to save the chat, so we can inform people who would like to.
Maybe I can I'll just, instead of that, the other way around. I'll just leave my email here.
Yeah, do that.
So everyone can harass me. If you're interested in participating in, we don't know what yet we'll be doing as a continuity of this for next year, please just send an email.
Yeah, and if you have ideas about what you want to do or what we should do, then yeah.
Yeah, we want to establish a kind of a top-down planning. We want to emerge organically from the discussion with the people who want to be part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll see what the future will bring. Thank you, everyone, for following this. Thank you for attending and discussing and sharing your thoughts. And we hope to continue the discussion very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Doug.